Some mistakes follow you home, even after 40 years of trying to outrun them. The richest man in 3 counties was about to learn that the hardest ground to cover isn't distance, it's time. Boone's old horse collapsed on what was meant to be their last ride, together across the prairie. Following the dying animal's final steps, he discovered an abandoned line shack wrapped in the roots of a massive oak tree. Inside that forgotten place, Boone found impossible things: his mother's old cooking pan, his father's journal, and a blood-stained saddlebag he'd buried decades ago. The tree hadn't just grown through the roof, it had grown from his buried past. But how could a place lost to time hold pieces of his life he'd tried so hard to forget? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other for Boone Mackenzie, though he'd known it would end differently. At 62, he'd learned to read the signs, the way Thunder's breathing had grown labored over the past weeks, how the old horse's eyes had taken on that distant look that comes before the final journey. Today would be their last ride together across the endless Montana prairie, a ritual of farewell between 2 old souls who'd shared more miles than either cared to count. From the wraparound porch of his sprawling ranch house, Boone surveyed the empire he'd built from nothing. The Mackenzie spread stretched beyond the horizon, encompassing nearly 30,000 acres of prime grazing land, 3 operational silver mines, and enough cattle to feed half the territory. The house itself was a monument to success: 12 rooms of imported furniture, crystal chandeliers, and Persian rugs that had never known the weight of a working man's boots. Yet, for all its grandeur, the place echoed with the hollowness of a man who'd climbed every mountain, only to discover he'd been climbing alone. They called him Silver-Tongue Boone in the saloons and trading posts, a name earned through decades of shrewd negotiations and silver-smooth talk that could convince a snake to buy its own skin. The moniker had served him well in business, opening doors and loosening purse strings from Denver to San Francisco. But lately, the name felt more like a weight than a gift, a reminder of all the words he'd spoken and the ones he'd left unsaid. Thunder stood waiting by the hitching post, his once magnificent coat now dulled with age, his proud head hanging low. The horse had been Boone's first real purchase after striking silver 40 years ago, a spirited paint stallion with fire in his eyes and lightning in his hooves. Now, arthritis had settled deep in the old horse's joints, and his breath came in ragged pulls that spoke of lungs working too hard for too little air. "Morning, old friend," Boone whispered, running his weathered hand along Thunder's neck. The horse turned his great head toward his master, and for a moment Boone saw a flicker of the young stallion who'd carried him through countless adventures across the territory, ready for one more dance. The ritual of saddling had become a meditation over the years. Boone's hands moved with practiced ease, adjusting the worn leather with the gentle touch of a man who understood the fragility of what he treasured. Thunder stood patient as stone, as if he too understood the significance of this final preparation. The silver mines that had made Boone's fortune lay scattered across the eastern edge of his property, their entrance shafts now sealed and silent. The Mackenzie mine, the Lucky Strike, and the Widow's Hope, each one had poured forth riches beyond his wildest dreams as a young cowhand. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very ground beneath his feet had held the solution to every problem he'd ever known, if only he'd had the wisdom to see it differently back then. As a boy growing up in a 2-room cabin with dirt floors and newspaper for wallpaper, Boone had dreamed of striking it rich. His father, Samuel Mackenzie, had been a man of simple faith and honest work, content to scratch out a living from stubborn soil and ornery cattle. His mother, Mary, had possessed the kind of gentle strength that could soothe a crying baby or calm a spooked horse with equal grace. They died within a year of each other when Boone was barely 20, leaving him with nothing but a handful of debts and a burning desire to prove that their son could rise above the circumstances that had claimed them. The path to wealth had been neither straight nor clean. Boone had hired his gun to cattle barons during range wars, had gambled away more money than most men saw in a lifetime, and had made deals with men whose handshakes came with the understanding that failure to honor agreements might result in a shallow grave. Through it all, his silver tongue had been his most valuable asset, turning potential enemies into reluctant allies and transforming handshake agreements into binding contracts that favored the young man with the persuasive smile. But success, when it finally came, had arrived at a price that only now, in the twilight of his years, did Boone fully comprehend. The mansion that should have been filled with the laughter of children echoed instead with the footsteps of paid staff who called him Sir and maintained careful distances. The fortune that should have secured happiness for generations sat largely untouched in banks across 3 states, earning interest for a man who'd forgotten how to spend money on anything that mattered. Thunder's hooves struck the packed earth of the yard with a hollow rhythm as they began their final journey together. The prairie stretched ahead like a golden sea, unmarked by fences or roads, vast enough to swallow a man's troubles and wide enough to hold his regrets. This had always been Boone's sanctuary, the place where the weight of wealth and reputation fell away, leaving only the essential truth of a man and his horse moving through God's country. The morning air carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, tinged with the promise of storm clouds, building along the distant mountains. Thunder moved with careful deliberation, each step measured and thoughtful, as if he understood that this journey was about more than simply covering ground. They followed no particular trail, guided instead by instinct and memory toward places that had shaped them both. As they rode, Boone found himself thinking about the young cowhand. He'd once been eager, ambitious, and certain that money could solve any problem worth solving. That young man had been willing to risk everything for the chance at something more, had burned bridges and broken promises in pursuit of a dream that had ultimately delivered exactly what he'd asked for. The tragedy was that he'd never bothered to ask if what he wanted was worth having. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the undulating grassland. In the distance, a red-tailed hawk circled lazily, riding thermals that carried it ever higher without apparent effort. Boone envied the bird, its freedom, its ability to soar without the burden of accumulated regrets or the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. Thunder stumbled, catching himself with visible effort. Boone felt the horse's labored breathing between his legs, heard the whistle in the old stallion's lungs that spoke of systems beginning to fail. Time was running short, and both man and horse seemed to understand that this ride would end differently than the thousands that had come before. They had covered perhaps 5 miles when Thunder's legs began to tremble. The proud horse, who had once carried Boone through blizzards and across flooded rivers, was finally admitting defeat to the one enemy that could not be outrun. Boone dismounted, his own joints protesting after years of hard living, and stood beside his oldest friend as Thunder's great head drooped toward the earth. "Easy, old boy," Boone murmured, his voice thick with emotion he'd kept locked away for decades. "You've earned your rest." Thunder's eyes, once bright with intelligence and fire, had grown cloudy with the approach of death, but in them Boone saw something that made his breath catch a look of profound understanding, as if the horse knew exactly what this moment meant and accepted it with the grace that had always defined him. It was a look that seemed to say that some journeys must be taken alone, but that the love shared along the way made every step worthwhile. The great horse took 3 more trembling steps forward, as if drawn by something only he could see, before his legs finally gave way. Thunder sank to his knees with a soft whicker, then rolled gently onto his side, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Boone knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on the horse's neck, feeling the flutter of life beneath warm hide. "Thank you," Boone whispered, the words carrying the weight of 40 years of partnership. Thunder's final breath came as a gentle sigh, his great heart finally stilling after a lifetime of carrying burdens both literal and metaphorical. In the sudden silence that followed, Boone felt something inside his own chest crack, not break, but split open like a seed that had been waiting decades for the right conditions to finally germinate. It was then, as he knelt beside his departed friend on the endless prairie, that Boone first noticed the line shack. The structure seemed to materialize from the prairie itself, as if the earth had exhaled and given form to memory. Where moments before there had been nothing but endless grassland, now stood an abandoned line shack, its weathered walls embraced by the gnarled roots of an ancient oak tree that had grown through and around the building until it was impossible to tell where wood ended and bark began. Boone rose slowly from Thunder's side, his knees creaking with the accumulated wear of 6 decades. The sight before him defied explanation. He'd ridden this stretch of prairie countless times over the years, knew every rise and depression, every cluster of sagebrush and prairie dog town. Yet here stood a structure he'd never seen before, impossible to miss and equally impossible to explain. The oak tree was magnificent and terrible in its ancient power. Its trunk, easily 6 feet across, had split the line shack's roof like a giant's fist punching through paper. But rather than destroying the building, the tree seemed to have absorbed it, weaving wood and nail into its living architecture until the two had become one entity. Roots thick as a man's waist coiled around the foundation, while smaller tendrils snaked through gaps in the walls, creating a latticework of living wood that pulsed with sap and secrets. Thunder's body lay perhaps 50 yards from the structure, positioned as if the old horse had been making his way toward this very spot when death finally claimed him. The thought sent a chill down Boone's spine. Had Thunder somehow known this place was here? Had some instinct drawn him toward this sanctuary in his final moments? The door to the line shack hung askew on leather hinges that had somehow survived decades of weather and neglect. Through the gap, Boone could see glimpses of an interior that should have been rotted and ruined, yet appeared strangely preserved, as if time moved differently within those root-wrapped walls. He approached with the careful steps of a man who'd learned to trust his instincts above all else. The prairie wind had died to an unnatural stillness, and even the insects seemed to have fallen silent, leaving only the sound of his own breathing and the soft whisper of leaves high above in the oak's crown. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing an interior that stole the breath from his lungs and sent his heart hammering against his ribs. The single room was small, perhaps 12 feet square, but it contained impossibilities that made his vision blur with confusion and recognition. There, sitting on a rough-hewn table as if it had been placed there moments ago, was his mother's old cooking pan. The iron surface was free of rust, seasoned to a perfect black patina that spoke of careful use and loving maintenance. Boone remembered that pan with crystal clarity, how his mother had used it to fry eggs on Sunday mornings, how she'd taught him to make cornbread in its depths, how it had been one of the few possessions they'd owned that carried real value beyond mere function. His father's journal lay beside the pan, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. Samuel Mackenzie had been a man of few words, but those he committed to paper had been chosen with the precision of a jeweler selecting stones. Boone had burned that journal 40 years ago, along with most of his parents' possessions, in a fit of grief and rage at the unfairness of a world that took good people too soon. Yet here it was, whole and real beneath his trembling fingers. He opened the journal with hands that shook like autumn leaves. His father's careful handwriting filled the pages, words of wisdom and gentle guidance written in the patient script of a man who believed in the power of quiet truth. One entry, dated just weeks before Samuel's death, seemed to glow on the yellowed page. A man's true wealth isn't measured by what he accumulates, but by what he's willing to sacrifice for others. Boone has the makings of greatness in him, but greatness without compassion is just another word for emptiness. I pray he learns the difference before it's too late. The words hit Boone like physical blows, each one precisely aimed at the hollow spaces in his soul. His father had seen something in him that he'd forgotten existed, potential for goodness that had been buried beneath years of ambition and compromise. The young man those words described felt like a stranger, someone he'd known once but had lost track of along the way. A sound like distant thunder rumbled through the shack, though the sky outside remained clear. The oak's roots along the walls seemed to pulse with life, and for a moment Boone could have sworn he heard something like a heartbeat echoing through the living wood. The very air in the shack felt charged with possibility and menace in equal measure. He found himself drawn deeper into the room, past shelves that held other impossible relics from his past. A child's wooden horse he'd carved with his father's help when he was 8 years old sat next to a faded tintype photograph of his parents on their wedding day. Books he remembered from childhood lined one wall, their spines cracked and familiar, filled with stories of adventure and heroism that had shaped his young imagination. But it was what he found in the corner that sent ice water through his veins and made his legs threaten to buckle beneath him. A blood-stained saddlebag sat propped against the wall, its leather dark with ancient stains that no amount of time or weather should have been able to preserve. Boone recognized it immediately. How could he forget? It was the same bag he'd buried 40 years ago after the worst night of his life, the night that had set him on the path to fortune and damnation in equal measure. His hands moved without conscious direction, lifting the bag and feeling its familiar weight. Inside, he knew, were things he'd tried to forget, things that had haunted his dreams and poisoned his success with the taste of ash and regret. The blood on the leather was Jake Morrison's blood, spilled the night friendship died and greed was born. The shack around him seemed to press closer, the oak's roots growing more prominent along the walls, as if the tree itself was responding to the weight of memory and guilt he carried. Wind began to whisper through the branches overhead, though no breeze stirred the grass outside, and in that whisper Boone could almost hear voices, his mother's gentle singing, his father's quiet wisdom, and underneath it all, another voice he'd tried for 40 years to forget. Jake Morrison had been his closest friend, his partner in dreams and schemes, the brother he'd never had. They'd planned to strike it rich together, to build something lasting that would lift their families out of poverty and secure their futures. Instead, Boone had chosen greed over friendship, self-preservation over loyalty, and had left his best friend to die alone in the wilderness while he claimed their shared discovery for himself. The saddlebag seemed to grow heavier in his hands as memories flooded back Jake's face in those final moments, the hurt and betrayal in his eyes, the way his blood had looked almost black in the moonlight as it soaked into the leather. Boone had buried the bag in a shallow grave, along with his conscience and the last remnants of the man his parents had raised him to be. Thunder's death had brought him here, to this impossible place where the past refused to stay buried and the weight of accumulated sins pressed down like stone. The oak tree's roots pulsed with life around him, and Boone began to understand that this was no random discovery. He'd been brought here, summoned by forces he couldn't comprehend but could no longer deny. The blood-stained saddlebag in his hands was proof that some debts could never be forgotten, only postponed. After 40 years of running, Boone Mackenzie had finally arrived at the place where all roads ended and all accounts came due. Outside, Thunder's body lay cooling in the prairie sun, the faithful horse's final service complete. He'd carried his master not just to the place of his own death, but to the site of a reckoning that had been 40 years in the making. The child's toy horse seemed to smile up at him from the dusty shelf, its wooden features carved with the innocent precision of young hands, guided by patient wisdom. Boone remembered the day he'd made it a winter afternoon when snow had trapped him and his father inside their little cabin, the wind howling like banshees while they worked by lamplight at the kitchen table. "Steady now," his father had whispered, Samuel's weathered hands covering Boone's small fingers as they guided the knife along the grain. "Let the wood tell you where it wants to be cut, force it, and you'll split what you're trying to create." The memory was so vivid that Boone could smell the wood shavings and feel his father's calloused palms against his own. He'd been 8 years old then, full of dreams about real horses and wide-open spaces, imagining adventures that stretched beyond the horizon of his small world. The toy had been his most prized possession for years, a tangible link to his father's love and the promise that someday he'd have a real horse to call his own. Yet here it sat, 40-plus years later, in a place that shouldn't exist, as perfectly preserved as the day he'd carved the final detail into its mane. Boone lifted the toy with trembling hands, running his thumb along the smooth curves he'd shaped with such care. The wood was warm to the touch, as if it had been sitting in sunlight rather than mouldering in an abandoned shack. Every nick and groove was exactly as he remembered, including the small heart he'd carved into the horse's flank, a secret symbol of the love he'd poured into its creation. The oak tree's roots along the walls pulsed gently, like the breathing of some great sleeping creature. The rhythm was almost hypnotic, and Boone found his own breathing synchronizing with the slow, steady beat. With each pulse, the memories seemed to flow more freely, washing over him in waves that threatened to pull him under. He remembered giving the toy horse to his younger cousin, Mary Catherine, when she'd come to visit that following spring. She'd been sick with fever, delirious and calling out for things that existed only in her fevered imagination. The wooden horse had comforted her somehow, and when she'd recovered, Boone had let her keep it. She'd died of consumption 2 winters later, and the toy had been buried with her at her parents' request. So how was it here now? How could something buried with a child 40 years ago be sitting on a shelf in an impossible shack that shouldn't exist? The questions multiplied like prairie grass after rain, each one spawning a dozen more. Nothing about this place made sense according to the rational world he'd built his fortune in. Yet the evidence was here in his hands, solid and real and impossible to deny. The boy who'd carved this horse had believed in magic, had accepted the possibility of miracles with the easy faith of youth. That boy had died slowly over the years, suffocated by pragmatism and greed, but perhaps some part of him still lived in this place, where impossibility was just another word for truth. Boone set the toy horse carefully back on its shelf and continued his exploration of the shack's impossible inventory. Each item told a story, painted a picture of the man he'd once been before ambition had rewritten his character. A primer book his mother had used to teach him letters sat next to a slingshot he'd made to hunt rabbits during the lean years. A handful of smooth river stones he'd collected as a boy lined a windowsill that looked out onto prairie that stretched beyond the curve of the earth. The strangest thing about the artifacts wasn't their impossible preservation or their presence in a place that couldn't exist. It was how they seemed to glow with warmth and life, as if they were more than mere objects. They felt like fragments of his soul, pieces of himself he'd thought lost forever to time and compromise. As he handled each memento, Boone began to sense a pattern in their arrangement. The items weren't randomly placed but seemed to follow some kind of timeline, starting with childhood treasures near the door and progressing toward more complex reminders of his youth and early manhood. The path led inevitably toward the blood-stained saddlebag in the corner, as if the shack itself was trying to guide him through the story of his life toward the moment when everything had changed. The oak tree's roots grew more pronounced along the back wall, forming intricate patterns that reminded him of the Celtic knots his Irish grandmother used to draw on the margins of her letters. The wood was dark with age and strange purpose, and when he pressed his palm against the largest root, he could swear he felt something like a pulse, not quite a heartbeat, but something alive and aware and patient beyond human understanding. A photograph caught his eye, tucked behind a small mirror on the opposite wall. It showed him at perhaps 20 years old, standing next to a young man with sandy hair and laughing eyes, Jake Morrison. They had their arms around each other's shoulders in the easy way of best friends who'd shared every secret and trusted each other with their lives. Both wore the confident grins of young men who believed the world owed them something grand and were determined to collect. The sight of Jake's face hit Boone like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and sending him stumbling backward against the root-covered wall. They'd been inseparable in those days, closer than brothers, united by shared poverty and shared dreams of something better. Jake had been the brother Boone had never had, the friend who'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. And Boone had betrayed him, had let greed poison their friendship and fear override their bond, had chosen silver over soul, and left his best friend to die alone in the wilderness. The roots pressed against his back seemed to warm at his touch, and for a moment Boone thought he heard something like whispers in the rustling of leaves overhead. The words were too faint to understand, but the tone was unmistakably sad, a sound like wind through empty houses or rain on unmarked graves. He forced himself to look at the photograph again, studying Jake's face for signs of the future neither of them could have imagined. There was nothing there but youth and hope and absolute trust in the friendship they'd thought would last forever. The betrayal that would tear them apart was still months in the future, a seed not yet planted in soil that seemed too rich with love to ever grow such bitter fruit. The wooden horse watched him from its shelf with painted eyes that seemed almost alive in the strange light filtering through the oak's canopy. It was a reminder of who he'd been before the world had taught him that innocence was a luxury he couldn't afford, and that trust was a weakness stronger men would exploit. Somewhere in this impossible place between memory and magic, between regret and redemption, Boone began to understand that he'd been brought here for a reason. The question that remained was whether he had the courage to face whatever truth this place was determined to reveal. The faded photograph lay face down on the table beside his father's journal, as if it had fallen from between the pages when he'd opened the leather-bound book. Boone turned it over with fingers that trembled despite his efforts to steady them, and found himself staring into the face of the young man he used to be. 20 years old in the image, he stood tall and proud in his best Sunday shirt, his arm draped companionably around Jake Morrison's shoulders. Both young men grinned at the camera with the easy confidence of those who believed the future held nothing but promise. It had been taken outside the church in Willowbrook after Jake had finally worked up the courage to ask Sarah Beth Coleman to the harvest dance. Boone remembered the day with startling clarity, how nervous Jake had been, pacing back and forth in front of the church like a caged wolf, running his hands through his sandy hair until it stuck up in all directions. Sarah Beth had said yes, of course. How could she refuse Jake Morrison with his gentle manner and honest smile? They'd planned to marry the following spring, after Jake and Boone made their fortune from the silver claim they'd discovered in the mountains. The silver claim that had destroyed everything. In the photograph, neither young man showed any sign of the tragedy that would tear their friendship apart within 6 months. Jake's eyes sparkled with love and hope, while Boone's reflected the fierce loyalty he'd felt for the brother of his heart. They'd sworn blood oaths as boys, cutting their palms with Boone's father's skinning knife and pressing their wounds together until their life force mingled. Brothers in all but blood, they'd promised to share everything, fortune and misfortune, joy and sorrow, success and failure. The photograph captured them at the peak of that brotherhood, when their word was their bond, and their friendship seemed as eternal as the mountains that surrounded their small town. Boone set the image down carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter more than just old paper. The weight of memory pressed against his chest like a stone, making each breath an effort that required conscious thought. He'd tried so hard to forget Jake's face, had burned every reminder of their friendship in a desperate attempt to silence the voice of conscience that whispered accusations in the darkest hours before dawn. But forgetting Jake Morrison was like trying to forget his own reflection. They'd been too close, had shared too much, had planned too many futures together for simple time to erase the bonds they'd forged. In quiet moments, Boone still found himself turning to share a joke or observation with a friend who'd been dead for 40 years, still felt the phantom ache of a brotherhood he'd severed with his own greedy hands. The oak tree's roots pulsed along the walls with increasing intensity, and the whispers in the leaves overhead grew more distinct, though still not quite clear enough to understand. The very air in the shack seemed to thicken, pregnant with possibility and menace in equal measure. Boone could feel something building, a pressure that reminded him of the moments before a summer storm breaks, when the atmosphere itself seems to hold its breath in anticipation. The artifacts around him began to seem less like random remnants and more like carefully chosen evidence in some cosmic trial. Each item spoke to the man he'd been before greed had rewritten his character, the boy who'd carved toys for sick cousins, the young man who'd sworn eternal friendship to a sandy-haired dreamer named Jake Morrison. They were proof that once, long ago, he'd been capable of love and loyalty and selfless devotion. What had happened to that young man? When had ambition become more important than honor? When had success begun to matter more than the souls of the people who helped him achieve it? The questions multiplied like ripples on still water, each one spreading wider than the last until they encompassed every choice he'd made, every compromise he'd accepted, every line he'd crossed in pursuit of wealth and status. He'd told himself for 40 years that he'd had no choice, that survival demanded pragmatism, that Jake would have done the same in his position. But the lies wore thin in this place, where truth seemed to seep from the very walls. Jake Morrison wouldn't have betrayed their friendship for all the silver in the mountains. Jake had possessed something Boone had lost along the way, an unshakable moral compass that pointed always toward what was right rather than what was profitable. A sound like distant thunder rolled through the shack, though the sky outside remained clear and blue. The roots along the walls contracted slightly, as if the great oak was tightening its grip on the building, drawing it deeper into its living embrace. Dust motes danced in the strange light that filtered through the canopy overhead, and for a moment Boone could swear he saw shapes in their swirling patterns, faces from his past, scenes from his youth, images of the life he might have lived if he'd chosen differently that terrible night in the mountains. The blood-stained saddlebag in the corner seemed to pulse with malevolent life, drawing his attention like a lodestone draws iron. He could feel its presence even when he looked away, could sense the weight of the secrets it contained and the price those secrets had demanded. 40 years ago, he'd buried that bag along with his conscience, convinced that time and success would eventually heal the wounds he'd inflicted on his own soul. He'd been wrong. Some wounds only grew deeper with age, fed by guilt and watered with the tears of sleepless nights. The saddlebag was proof that the past was never truly buried, only waiting for the right moment to claw its way back to the surface. The photograph of him and Jake seemed to watch him from the table, their younger selves frozen in a moment of perfect trust and brotherhood. Those young men had believed their friendship was stronger than any temptation the world could offer. They'd sworn oaths that seemed as binding as natural law, had made promises they'd thought nothing could break. But Boone had broken them all, had chosen silver over soul, wealth over worth, and had spent 40 years trying to convince himself that the price had been worth paying. The oak tree knew better. The artifacts knew better. And deep in his heart, beneath layers of rationalization and self-justification, Boone Mackenzie knew better too. The reckoning he'd avoided for 4 decades had finally found him, and there was nowhere left to run. Jake's silver mining map lay folded beneath a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, its edges worn soft from countless foldings and unfoldings. Boone's hands shook as he lifted it from its resting place, recognizing immediately the careful cartographer's hand that had marked every ridge and stream, every promising outcrop and potential hazard in the mountains above Willowbrook. The paper crackled as he spread it across the table, revealing the intricate web of lines and notations that had changed both their lives forever. Jake had always been the better map-maker, possessed of an almost supernatural ability to read the land and understand the hidden stories written in stone and soil. While Boone had the silver tongue that could charm money from tight-fisted bankers, Jake had the golden eye that could spot mineral wealth where others saw only worthless rock. The map showed the entire eastern face of the Bearhead Mountains, from Widow's Creek in the south to Devil's Canyon in the north. Jake had spent 3 summers surveying and documenting every promising site, creating what he'd called his treasure map to the future. The detail was extraordinary: contour lines drawn with mathematical precision, elevation markers calculated to the foot, even notes about seasonal water sources and game trails. But it was the bright red X marking their claim that drew Boone's attention like flame draws a moth. There, in Jake's careful script, were the words that had sealed both their fates. The mother lode, enough silver to buy the world, or lose your soul trying. Boone traced the mark with his fingertip, remembering the day they'd made that incredible discovery. It had been a Tuesday in late September, the aspens already turning gold in the high country, when Jake's persistence had finally paid off. They'd been working a played-out placer claim for weeks, finding barely enough color to justify the back-breaking labor, when Jake had noticed something odd about the rock formation above their campsite. "Look at this, Boone," he'd said, his voice tight with excitement. "See how the quartz vein runs through that granite, and the way it's discolored right there where the water seeps out?" Boone had looked but seen nothing except more of the same disappointment they'd been digging through for months. But Jake's trained eye had spotted what would prove to be the richest silver strike in territorial history, a vein so pure and extensive that a single day's work could yield more wealth than most men saw in a lifetime. The map bore witness to Jake's meticulous planning. Every notation spoke to his careful nature, his desire to do things properly and legally. Margin notes detailed their agreement to split everything 50-50, with additional provisions for taking care of their families and investing in the future of Willowbrook. Jake had even sketched out plans for a school and a hospital, institutions their small community desperately needed but couldn't afford. "We're going to be rich, Boone," Jake had said that first night, after they'd confirmed the strike's extent. They'd sat by their campfire, passing a bottle of whiskey back and forth and staring up at stars that seemed close enough to pluck from the sky, rich enough to help everyone we care about, rich enough to make a real difference in this world. Jake's vision had extended far beyond personal gain. He'd talked about building a proper church for Willowbrook, about bringing in a real doctor instead of relying on old Doc Patterson's questionable remedies. He dreamed of establishing a fund for widows and orphans, of creating opportunities for young people who might otherwise be trapped by the poverty that had defined their own childhoods. But there had been a problem, a complication that had tested the strength of their friendship and ultimately destroyed it. The claim they'd discovered sat partially on land that belonged to the Consolidated Mining Company, a powerful corporation with deep pockets and deeper connections to territorial politicians. When word of their strike inevitably leaked out, Consolidated had moved quickly to assert their ownership rights to the disputed ground. The legal battle had been swift and brutal. Consolidated's lawyers had descended on Willowbrook like locusts, armed with surveys and deeds that seemed to prove their client's claim to the land. Jake and Boone's hastily filed paperwork looked amateurish by comparison, full of the kind of technical errors that expensive legal teams knew how to exploit. But Consolidated had made them an offer, a buyout, that would have set both young men up for life, though not with the vast fortune the claim could have generated. Jake had been inclined to take it, reasoning that a comfortable living honestly earned was better than a fortune gained through endless litigation they couldn't afford. Boone had disagreed. He'd seen an opportunity to play all sides against each other, to use his persuasive skills to extract maximum value from a complex situation. Where Jake saw ethical complications, Boone saw negotiating positions. Where Jake worried about right and wrong, Boone calculated profit and loss. The map contained evidence of Jake's final attempt at compromise, a proposal written in his careful hand that would have divided the claim between all parties based on actual land ownership, with Consolidated taking the largest share, but Jake and Boone retaining enough to secure their futures. It was a reasonable solution that acknowledged everyone's legitimate interests while preserving the friendship that meant more to Jake than any amount of silver. Boone had pretended to agree while secretly negotiating his own deal with Consolidated. They'd offered him a partnership, a chance to buy in as a junior partner in exchange for helping them secure clear title to the entire claim. All he had to do was testify that Jake had acted improperly in filing their original paperwork, that his friend had tried to claim land he knew belonged to someone else. The betrayal had been subtle at first, disguised as legal maneuvering and business pragmatism. But Jake had possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people, and he'd seen through Boone's carefully constructed lies with heartbreaking clarity. Their final confrontation had taken place in this very valley, beside a stream that ran silver in the moonlight, while their friendship died in accusations and bitter words. The map trembled in Boone's hands as the memories crashed over him like floodwater. Every careful notation Jake had made spoke to his friend's fundamental decency, his desire to do right by everyone involved. The margin notes revealed a man whose greatest concern wasn't personal wealth, but the welfare of those he cared about. Boone had destroyed all of that for 30 pieces of silver and a partnership in an enterprise built on betrayal. The blood-stained bandana hung from a wooden peg near the back corner of the shack, its blue cotton fabric darkened with stains that time should have long since faded. Boone recognized it immediately. Jake had worn it every day for the 3 years of their friendship, claiming it brought him luck in prospecting. His sister had sewn it for him from scraps of her own dress, embroidering his initials in white thread along one corner in a display of sibling affection that had always made Boone envious. The sight of it hanging there, preserved as if the violence of that terrible night had happened yesterday rather than 40 years ago, sent ice water through Boone's veins and made his legs weak beneath him. He'd last seen that bandana pressed against the gash in Jake's forehead, soaking up blood that had looked black in the moonlight while his friend lay dying beside Silver Creek. Boone reached for the bandana with trembling fingers, half expecting it to crumble at his touch. Instead, the fabric felt soft and real, still carrying the faint scent of sage and mountain air that had always clung to Jake's clothes. The bloodstains were darker now, oxidized with age, but still unmistakably present physical evidence of the violence that had ended their friendship and changed the course of both their lives. The memories crashed over him with the force of an avalanche, carrying him back to that moonlit night when everything had gone so terribly wrong. They'd agreed to meet at their old campsite, beside Silver Creek, ostensibly to sign the papers that would formalize their partnership with Consolidated Mining. Jake had been suspicious of the arrangement, troubled by reports that Boone had been meeting secretly with the company's lawyers. But their friendship had still been strong enough that Jake had come anyway, trusting in bonds forged over years of shared dreams and mutual dependence. "I know what you're planning, Boone," Jake had said without preamble as soon as his friend emerged from the shadows. The moonlight had turned his sandy hair silver and made his eyes look black as coal. "I know you've been talking to Consolidated behind my back. What I can't figure out is why." Boone had tried to lie, to spin the situation with the silver tongue that had served him so well in business negotiations. But Jake had seen through every careful evasion, had cut through the verbal smokescreens with the sharp blade of lifelong friendship. They'd known each other too well for deception to survive long exposure. "They offered me a partnership," Boone had finally admitted, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. 20% of the company, in exchange for helping them secure clear title to the claim. "It's a better deal than we could get fighting them in court." "A better deal for who?" Jake's voice had carried a note of hurt that cut deeper than anger ever could. "What about our agreement? What about splitting everything 50-50? Be practical, Jake. We can't win against them in a legal fight. This way, at least one of us comes out ahead. One of us." Jake had repeated the words slowly, as if testing them for some hidden meaning. What happened to us being brothers? What happened to sharing everything, fortune and misfortune alike? The confrontation had escalated from there, fueled by Boone's guilt and Jake's wounded sense of betrayal. Words had been spoken that couldn't be taken back, accusations hurled like stones that shattered the foundation of their friendship. Jake had called Boone a traitor and a coward. Boone had responded by claiming Jake was too naive for the harsh realities of business, too weak to do what survival demanded. It might have ended there, with harsh words and a broken friendship. If Jake hadn't threatened to expose Boone's secret negotiations to the territorial authorities, the silver claim had made them both targets for claim jumpers and violent men who would kill for a fraction of what they'd discovered. Jake's revelation could have put Boone's life in danger, could have destroyed the careful arrangements he'd made to secure his future. The physical fight had started when Jake tried to leave, disgusted by his friend's betrayal and determined to file his own legal challenge to Consolidated's claims. Boone had grabbed his arm, trying to reason with him, trying to make him understand the impossible position they were in. Jake had pulled free, but in doing so had stumbled backward over a loose stone and struck his head against a granite boulder beside the creek. The sound of Jake's skull cracking against stone would haunt Boone's dreams for the rest of his life. His friend had fallen unconscious, blood flowing freely from a deep gash in his forehead. In that moment, faced with Jake's prone form and the spreading pool of crimson that reflected the moonlight like liquid silver, Boone had made the choice that would define the rest of his existence. He could have helped, could have bound the wound and gotten Jake to a doctor in Willowbrook, could have chosen friendship over fortune and saved the life of the man who'd been closer than a brother. Instead, he'd taken Jake's saddlebag, the one containing all the legal documents related to their claim, and had left his friend to bleed out beside Silver Creek while he rode back to town to finalize his deal with Consolidated Mining. The bandana in his hands bore witness to that terrible night, its fabric stiff with the blood of betrayed friendship and murdered trust. Jake had used it to try to stanch the bleeding from his head wound, pressing the cotton against his forehead in a futile attempt to stop the flow of life from his body. He died alone in the wilderness, abandoned by the friend he'd trusted above all others, while Boone was signing papers that would make him rich. The oak tree's roots pulsed with increasing intensity along the walls of the shack, and the whispers in the leaves overhead grew more distinct. Boone could almost make out words now, accusations spoken in Jake's familiar voice, questions about honor and loyalty that had no comfortable answers. The blood on the bandana seemed fresh in the strange light that filtered through the oak's canopy, and for a moment Boone could swear he smelled the metallic scent of spilled life. His hands shook so violently that he nearly dropped the fabric, his vision blurring with tears that had been 40 years in the making. Jake Morrison had died believing in their friendship, trusting that his blood brother would never abandon him in his hour of greatest need. He'd been wrong about that trust, but his faith in their bond had remained unshaken even as his life ebbed away in the moonlight beside Silver Creek. The bandana was proof of that faith, evidence of loyalty that had endured even unto death. The letter was hidden in a hollowed-out section of one of the oak's massive roots, concealed behind a piece of bark that came away at Boone's touch, as if it had been waiting 40 years for this moment. The paper was yellowed with age, but perfectly preserved, folded with the careful precision Jake had brought to everything he did. Boone's name was written across the front in handwriting he would have recognized anywhere, even after all these years. His hands trembled as he unfolded the letter, revealing lines of text written in Jake's careful script. The ink had faded to brown, but every word was legible, as if the oak tree itself had protected this final message from the ravages of time and weather. "My dear friend Boone," the letter began, and those simple words hit him like physical blows. After everything that had happened between them, after the betrayal and abandonment, Jake had still considered him a friend in those final moments. "If you are reading this, then the tree has finally brought you home to face what we both knew would have to be faced someday. I have perhaps an hour left before the bleeding takes me beyond the reach of earthly concerns, and I want to spend that time setting things right between us." Boone's vision blurred with tears as he continued reading. Jake had known he was dying that night beside Silver Creek, had understood that help would not come, yet had chosen to spend his final moments not in bitterness, but in an attempt at reconciliation. I forgive you, Boone. I forgive you for the lies and the secret negotiations. I forgive you for choosing money over friendship. Most of all, I forgive you for leaving me here to die alone, because I understand the fear that drove you to it. We both knew that silver claim was more than either of us could handle properly, and perhaps my death is the price that had to be paid for our hubris in thinking we could control such wealth. The words swam before Boone's eyes as the full magnitude of Jake's forgiveness washed over him. For 40 years, he'd carried the weight of guilt and shame, convinced that his betrayal was unforgivable, that Jake had died cursing his name. Instead, his friend had used his final moments to absolve him of the very sins that had tormented him for decades. But forgiveness comes with responsibility, my friend. The wealth you gained from our discovery was bought with my blood, and that makes it sacred in ways that ordinary money could never be. You must use it not for your own comfort alone, but to honor the dreams we shared when we were young and believed we could change the world for the better. Jake's vision for their shared fortune was detailed in the letter with heartbreaking clarity. Schools for children who couldn't afford education, hospitals for communities too small to attract doctors, funds for widows and orphans left destitute by mining accidents and territorial violence. All the charitable works they'd planned together during those long nights around campfires in the high country when the future had seemed bright with possibility. I know you have the strength to carry this burden, Boone, because I've seen your heart when you thought no one was watching. Remember how you gave your winter coat to old Pete when his cabin burned down? Remember how you worked extra shifts to help pay for Mary Sullivan's medicine when her husband was laid up with the lung fever? The man who could do those things can find his way back to the light, even after walking so long in the shadows. The letter revealed Jake's final act of friendship, a decision that took Boone's breath away with its generosity and understanding. Instead of exposing Boone's betrayal or seeking revenge from beyond the grave, Jake had chosen to create a path toward redemption. I have buried the deed to my family's land here beneath the oak tree, along with papers that will transfer my share of the claim to you legally and without question. Use these documents to secure your partnership with Consolidated, but remember that the wealth they bring you belongs as much to the people of our community as it does to you. I trust you to do what's right, not because you owe it to me, but because it's who you truly are beneath the fear and ambition. The tree had grown from Jake's grave. The realization struck Boone with the force of revelation, explaining the supernatural elements that had drawn him to this place. His friend hadn't simply died beside Silver Creek, he'd been buried here, in this very spot, and the oak had grown from soil enriched by his sacrifice. Every root that pulsed with mysterious life was connected to Jake's bones. Every whisper in the leaves carried echoes of his voice. Don't grieve for me too long, old friend. I go to my rest knowing that you will carry on the work we started together, build that school we talked about, fund that hospital we planned, help the families we swore to lift out of poverty. Do these things and my death will have meaning beyond the tragic accident it appears to be. The letter concluded with words that shattered what remained of Boone's carefully constructed defenses. I have one final request. Boone, when you have fulfilled your obligations to our community and our shared dreams, plant a tree beside this one. Not for me, I have all the monument I need in the oak that grows from my grave, but for the friendship we shared before fear and greed poisoned it. Plant that tree as a symbol that love can grow even in soil that has known betrayal, that hope can flourish even where hearts have been broken. Beneath the letter, wrapped in oiled cloth that had kept them dry for 4 decades, were the documents Jake had promised. The deed to his family's land, made out in Boone's name. Transfer papers that would give him clear legal title to both halves of the silver claim. Letters of recommendation from territorial officials who had respected Jake's honesty and integrity. Everything Boone needed to legitimize his fortune was there, freely given by the friend he'd betrayed and abandoned. Jake had spent his dying moments not in anger or recrimination, but in creating a path for Boone's redemption and the fulfillment of their shared dreams. The oak tree's roots pulsed gently along the walls, no longer threatening but welcoming, as if Jake's spirit was finally at peace now that his message had been delivered. The whispers in the leaves had changed too, becoming less like accusations and more like the gentle guidance Jake had always offered when they were young and their friendship was pure. Boone clutched the letter to his chest and wept 40 years' worth of tears, mourning not just for his friend's death, but for the man he himself had been, before fear and ambition had corrupted his heart. Jake's forgiveness was a gift beyond price, but it came with a responsibility that would require him to become worthy of the friendship that had endured even beyond death. The deed to Jake's family land lay spread across the table like a roadmap to redemption, its legal language made sacred by the blood of the friend who had signed it in his final moments. The property encompassed nearly 2,000 acres of prime grazing land in the valley below Willowbrook, land that Jake's grandfather had homesteaded and his family had worked for 3 generations. According to the transfer papers, it now belonged to Boone, another gift from beyond the grave, another chance to honor the dreams they'd shared as young men. But it was what Jake had written in the margins of the deed that made Boone's heart race with possibility and terror in equal measure. In his careful script, his dying friend had noted the names and locations of his surviving relatives, a sister in Denver, 2 nephews in California, a cousin who'd married and moved to Oregon Territory. The fortune that Boone had built on Jake's sacrifice could finally find its way to the people who deserved it most. The oak tree's presence had changed since he'd read the letter. Where before the roots had seemed threatening, pulsing with supernatural menace, now they radiated a warmth that reminded him of sitting by his mother's fire on winter evenings. The whispers in the leaves had become clearer too, no longer the incomprehensible murmur of wind through branches, but something approaching actual communication. Jake's voice, gentle and encouraging, urging him toward the choice that would set both their spirits free. Boone gathered the scattered artifacts from around the shack, arranging them on the table with the reverence due to holy relics. His mother's cooking pan, his father's journal, the wooden horse he'd carved as a boy. Each item was a piece of the puzzle that made up his true character, evidence of the man he'd been before ambition had led him astray. Together, they told the story of someone capable of love and loyalty, someone worthy of the forgiveness Jake had offered from his deathbed. The blood-stained bandana lay beside the letter, its dark stains a reminder of the price that had been paid for Boone's fortune. But even that grim memento seemed transformed by Jake's words of absolution, becoming less a symbol of guilt and more a call to action. His friend's blood had bought him time and opportunity 40 years to build an empire that could now be used for the purposes Jake had envisioned. Outside the shack, Thunder's body lay cooling in the prairie sun, the faithful horse's final service complete. He'd carried his master not to a place of judgment, but to a sanctuary where healing could begin. The old stallion had somehow known what Boone needed, had followed his own mysterious instincts to this spot where past and present intersected, where wrongs could finally be made right. The afternoon light, filtering through the oak's canopy, had taken on a golden quality that reminded Boone of autumn evenings in his childhood, when the world seemed touched with magic and anything felt possible. He could feel Jake's presence more strongly now, not as a haunting spectre, but as a beloved friend offering guidance and support. The fear that had gripped him since entering the shack was giving way to something he hadn't felt in 40 years, hope. But hope came with obligations that would require him to abandon everything he'd built for himself over 4 decades. The mansion in Willowbrook would have to be sold, along with the silver mines and vast cattle herds that represented his accumulated wealth. He would have to track down Jake's scattered family members, would have to find ways to distribute his fortune that honored his friend's vision of community service and charitable giving. The magnitude of the task ahead was staggering. Jake's sister Mary had married a merchant named Williams and moved to Denver, where she was raising 4 children on a clerk's wages. His nephews in California were struggling farmers, trying to make ends meet on marginal land that barely supported their families. The cousin in Oregon had written to Jake years ago about starting a lumber business, but lacking the capital to purchase proper equipment. Each of these family members deserved a share of the wealth their lost relative had helped create. More than that, they deserved to know the truth about Jake's death and his final acts of love and forgiveness. Boone would have to face them all, would have to confess his role in their brother's, uncle's, cousin's death and accept whatever judgment they rendered. The prospect terrified him more than any business negotiation or mining accident he'd faced over the years. These people had every right to hate him, to reject his attempts at restitution, to curse his name for the rest of their days. Some of them might even demand legal justice for Jake's death, though the letter would make prosecution difficult. But Jake's voice in the wind encouraged him to have faith in the fundamental decency of people who'd been raised with the same values that had shaped his friend's character. The Morrison family had always been known for their integrity and compassion, for their willingness to forgive even grievous wrongs when the repentance was sincere. The territorial authorities would be another challenge. Consolidated Mining Company had long since been dissolved, its assets scattered among various corporate successors over the decades. But the legal framework that had legitimized Boone's claim to the silver could also be used to redistribute the wealth that claim had generated. With proper documentation and legal counsel, he could establish trusts and foundations that would ensure Jake's vision was carried out long after his own death. The oak tree's roots pulsed with gentle rhythm along the walls, and Boone found himself matching his breathing to their beat. With each inhalation, he felt some of the guilt and shame that had poisoned his success beginning to lift. With each exhalation, he released another piece of the carefully constructed justifications he'd used to rationalize his betrayal of friendship. He thought about the school Jake had wanted to build in Willowbrook, the hospital they'd planned to fund, the scholarships they'd discussed for promising young people trapped by poverty. 40 years of compound interest and careful investment had multiplied their original silver strike many times over. There was more than enough money to fulfill every dream they'd shared during those long nights around mountain campfires. But beyond the material obligations lay a deeper responsibility, the need to become worthy of the forgiveness Jake had offered. Money could build schools and hospitals, could lift families out of poverty and create opportunities for future generations. But it couldn't restore a friendship or resurrect a man whose life had been cut short by betrayal and abandonment. That restoration would have to come from within, from a fundamental change in how Boone chose to live whatever years remained to him. He would have to learn again what his father had tried to teach him through word and example, that true wealth came not from what a man accumulated, but from what he was willing to sacrifice for others. The artifacts on the table glowed in the golden light, each one a reminder of the values that had shaped his character before fear and greed had corrupted it. His mother's cooking pan spoke of hospitality and nurturing care for others. His father's journal contained wisdom about integrity and moral courage. The wooden horse represented the innocent joy of creation, of making something beautiful simply for the pleasure of giving it away. Jake's letter lay at the center of it all, its faded ink somehow the most vibrant thing in the room. Every word was a benediction, every sentence a roadmap toward redemption. His friend had died believing in Boone's capacity for goodness, had staked his eternal rest on the conviction that love was stronger than betrayal, that hope could flourish even in soil watered with tears of regret. The time for hesitation was over. The choice that would define the rest of his life lay before him, as clear and inevitable as sunrise after the darkest night. He could continue living as Silver-Tongue Boone, the wealthy rancher who'd built his empire on a foundation of betrayed friendship. Or he could choose to become someone worthy of Jake Morrison's dying trust, someone who understood that true fortune was measured not in silver, but in souls. The oak tree's whispers grew more insistent, and Boone could almost see Jake's face in the dancing patterns of light and shadow on the shack's walls. His friend was waiting, patient as stone but expectant as spring, for the decision that would set them both free. The ceremonial peace pipe lay wrapped in soft deerskin beneath the floorboards where Jake's letter had directed him to look, its carved stone bowl and wooden stem as perfectly preserved as everything else in this impossible sanctuary. Boone lifted it with reverent hands, recognizing immediately the intricate patterns carved into the red pipestone symbols of harmony and spiritual cleansing that Jake had learned from his grandmother, who'd been half Crow and had taught him the old ways alongside Christian prayers. Jake had always carried the pipe during their prospecting expeditions, using it to mark important moments and seal significant agreements. They'd smoked it together the night they'd struck silver, passing it back and forth while they planned their future and swore eternal friendship under stars that seemed to approve of their brotherhood. Now it would serve a different purpose as an instrument of confession and a bridge between the living and the dead. Boone's hands trembled as he filled the bowl with sacred tobacco that had somehow remained fresh after 4 decades. The ritual came back to him with startling clarity: how to hold the pipe, how to offer smoke to the 4 directions and the spirits that dwelt beyond the veil of mortal sight. Jake's grandmother had taught them both, insisting that some ceremonies transcended religious boundaries and spoke to truths older than any church. He struck a match with fingers that shook like autumn leaves, holding the flame to the tobacco until fragrant smoke began to curl upward through the oak's canopy. The first breath burned his lungs with righteous fire, carrying with it the taste of mountain air and distant memories. As the smoke rose toward the heavens, Boone felt something shift in the atmosphere around him, a presence that was unmistakably Jake, no longer filtered through whispers and shadows, but standing beside him as real as life. "I've been waiting for you to come home." Jake's voice carried the same gentle warmth it had possessed in life, unmarked by death or the passage of years. Boone could see him now, translucent but unmistakable, wearing the same clothes he died in, but somehow free of blood and pain. "I've been waiting 40 years for you to find your way back to who you really are." Boone fell to his knees, the pipe clutched against his chest, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I'm sorry, Jake. I'm so damn sorry for everything I did to you, everything I stole from you. I left you to die alone, and I've lived with that shame every day since. I know." Jake's spirit settled onto the ground beside him, close enough that Boone could feel the warmth of forgiveness radiating from his presence. "I felt your guilt all these years, carried it with me even in death, because I couldn't bear to see you suffer for choices that fear drove you to make. That's why I had to bring you here, not for judgment, but for healing." The confession poured from Boone's lips like water from a broken dam, 40 years of suppressed guilt and self-recrimination flowing out in words that had waited decades to be spoken. He told Jake about the sleepless nights, the wealth that had turned to ashes in his mouth, the loneliness that no amount of success could fill. He spoke of Thunder's faithful companionship and how the old horse had somehow known to bring him to this place of reckoning. "You were the best friend I ever had," Boone whispered, his voice breaking on words that carried the weight of a lifetime's regret. "You trusted me with everything, and I betrayed that trust for money. How can you forgive something like that?" Jake's spirit smiled with the same gentle understanding he'd shown in life. "Because forgiveness isn't about what you deserve, old friend. It's about what love chooses to give freely. You were my brother in all but blood, and that bond doesn't break just because fear made you stumble in the darkness." The pipe passed between them, Boone solid and weeping, Jake translucent but radiating peace, as if death were merely another state of being rather than an ending. With each shared breath, Boone felt the chains of guilt that had bound him for 40 years beginning to dissolve. The weight that had pressed against his chest since that terrible night beside Silver Creek was lifting, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten existed: the possibility of redemption. "I'll make it right," Boone promised, his voice steady for the first time since entering the shack. "I'll find your family, I'll give away the fortune, I'll build the school and the hospital. I'll spend whatever years I have left trying to honor the dreams we shared when we were young and believed we could change the world." Jake nodded, his form becoming more solid as Boone's commitment deepened. "I never doubted you would. Even in my dying moments, I knew that someday the man I'd called brother would find his way back to the light. That's why I planted the oak, why I left the letter, why I waited all these years for thunder to bring you home." The sacred smoke continued to rise between them, carrying prayers and promises toward whatever realm awaited souls that had found their peace. Jake's wedding ring lay hidden in a small wooden box beneath the final floorboard, its simple gold band catching the afternoon light like captured sunlight. Boone lifted it with reverent hands, remembering how his friend had saved every penny for months to buy it, how he'd carried it in his pocket for weeks before working up the courage to propose to Sarah Beth Coleman. The ring had been meant to seal a future that death had stolen away, a symbol of love that had never been given the chance to grow into marriage and family. "She never knew, did she?" Boone whispered, holding the ring up to catch the light filtering through the oak's leaves. "She never knew how much you loved her." Jake's spirit settled beside him, more solid now than before, his presence radiating the profound sadness of dreams deferred by tragedy. "Sarah Beth married a banker from Denver 2 years after I died, had 4 children, and lived a good life. I used to watch over her sometimes, made sure she was happy and safe. That was enough for me." The ring was warm against Boone's palm, as if it had been recently worn rather than buried for 40 years. He could imagine Jake polishing it by firelight during those long evenings at their mining camp, planning exactly how he would ask for Sarah Beth's hand, what words he would use to convince her father that a poor prospector could provide for his daughter's future. "I had it all planned," Jake continued, his voice carrying the wistful tone of roads not taken. "A little house on the hill overlooking town, maybe a few acres for a garden and some chickens. She always said she wanted to teach school before we had children of our own. We would have made a good life together." The weight of what had been lost struck Boone like a physical blow. Jake's death hadn't just robbed him of life, it had stolen away Sarah Beth's future happiness, had prevented the children they might have raised together, had erased entire generations that should have carried his friend's gentle spirit forward through time. The ripples of that one terrible night had spread far beyond Boone's understanding, touching lives and futures in ways he'd never considered. "All these years," Boone said, his voice breaking with the magnitude of his comprehension, "I thought I'd only betrayed you. I never realized how many other people suffered because of what I did. Sarah Beth, your family, the children you'll never have, how many lives did my greed destroy?" Jake's spirit reached out and placed a translucent hand on Boone's shoulder, the touch carrying more comfort than condemnation. "Sarah Beth had a good life, even if it wasn't the one we planned together. Her children grew up strong and decent, and her husband loved her truly. The future doesn't always unfold the way we expect, but that doesn't mean it's without value." But Boone could see the truth in his friend's eyes. Jake had spent 40 years watching the life he'd been denied play out in shadows and echoes, loving from a distance a woman who'd moved on because she'd had no choice. The sacrifice was profound and heartbreaking, made even more poignant by Jake's acceptance of circumstances he'd never been able to change. "I want you to take this," Jake said, indicating the ring with a gesture that carried decades of accumulated longing. "When you find my family, when you tell them what really happened, I want you to give this to Mary. My sister deserves to know that her brother died thinking of love rather than money, that his last thoughts were of the future we'd planned rather than the silver we'd found." Boone closed his fingers around the wedding ring, feeling its weight as a sacred trust. The simple gold band represented everything noble and pure about his friend's character, the capacity for selfless love, the willingness to sacrifice for others' happiness, the faith in futures built on hope rather than greed. It was proof that even in death, Jake's first concern was for those he'd loved in life. "I'll find her," Boone promised, his voice steady with conviction. "I'll tell her everything about the mine, about that night, about how you forgave me in your letter. I'll make sure she knows what kind of man her brother really was." Jake's form began to shimmer and fade as the afternoon light shifted toward evening, but his smile remained clear and bright. "Then my watch is finally ended. For 40 years I've been bound to this place by unfinished business and unspoken truths. Now that you've found your way back to who you're meant to be, I can finally rest." The wedding ring grew heavier in Boone's palm as Jake's spirit prepared to depart for whatever realm awaited souls that had completed their earthly obligations. The oak tree's roots along the walls pulsed with a gentle rhythm that spoke of peace rather than supernatural menace, and the whispers in the leaves became a song of benediction rather than accusation. "Thank you," Boone whispered to the fading presence of his dearest friend. "Thank you for waiting, for forgiving, for showing me the way home." "Thank you for becoming worthy of the faith I never lost in you," Jake replied, his voice growing distant as his spirit finally found its peace. 6 months later, Boone Mackenzie stood in the same spot where Thunder had died, but the world around him had transformed as completely as his own heart. The ancient oak still rose majestically from the prairie, its massive trunk and spreading canopy unchanged, but the line shack had been lovingly restored to its original purpose as a way station for travelers crossing the vast grasslands. Fresh timber and honest labor had repaired the roof where roots no longer intruded, while the walls had been carefully cleared of their living architecture without disturbing the tree's fundamental connection to the structure. The new sapling growing beside the oak's mighty trunk stood barely 4 feet tall, its tender leaves catching the morning light like small green prayers offered to the sky. Boone had planted it, according to Jake's final request, not as a monument to their friendship, but as a symbol that love could take root even in soil that had known betrayal, that hope could flourish where hearts had been broken and mended again. The fortune that had once belonged to Silver-Tongue Boone was gone, distributed among Jake's surviving relatives according to the carefully drafted legal documents that now rested in law offices across 3 territories. Mary Williams, Jake's sister, had wept when Boone appeared at her Denver home with his confession and his gifts. She'd forgiven him with the same grace her brother had shown in death, understanding that guilt had been punishment enough for 4 decades of living with the weight of betrayal. Jake's nephews in California now owned productive farms with proper equipment and clear title to land that would support their families for generations. The cousin in Oregon had his lumber business, along with enough capital to make it profitable and sustainable. Each family member had received not just money, but the truth about Jake's character and the love he'd carried for them even unto death. The wedding ring had found its way to Sarah Beth Williams, née Coleman, who'd accepted it with tears and gratitude for the closure it provided. Her husband had been present for that difficult conversation, a decent man who understood that some loves transcend death and deserve to be honored rather than feared. She'd worn the ring on a chain around her neck during the dedication ceremony for the new school in Willowbrook, built with funds from the Mackenzie Charitable Trust and named in Jake Morrison's honor. That school now served children from across the territory, offering education to young minds that might otherwise have been trapped by the poverty and isolation of frontier life. The hospital stood beside it, staffed by doctors whose salaries were guaranteed by the trust that would continue Jake's work long after Boone himself joined his friend in whatever realm awaited souls that had found their peace. Boone's own dwelling had changed as dramatically as his circumstances. The mansion in Willowbrook had been sold, its proceeds added to the charitable funds that honored Jake's memory. In its place, he'd built a simple cabin near the restored line shack, close enough to tend the young tree and maintain the way station for travelers who needed shelter from the storms that swept across the endless prairie. His life had found a rhythm as different from his previous existence as sunrise differed from midnight. Each morning brought visitors, settlers heading west, cowboys moving herds to market, families fleeing poverty or persecution in search of new beginnings. The line shack offered them rest and sustenance, while Boone's own cabin provided whatever comfort and counsel he could offer to fellow travelers on life's uncertain road. The wealth was gone, but he'd never felt richer. The isolation that had defined his years as a mining magnate had been replaced by genuine human connection, by the daily opportunity to serve others and honor the friendship that had shaped his youth. He'd learned again what his father had tried to teach him through word and example, that true fortune came not from what a man accumulated, but from what he was willing to give away. Thunder's grave was marked with a simple stone that bore his name and the dates of his faithful service. The old horse lay beneath prairie grass that grew green and strong, nourished by the body of a friend who'd carried his master not to judgment, but to redemption. Boone visited the grave each morning, offering words of gratitude to the companion who'd somehow known where healing could be found. The wind that whispered through the oak's branches no longer carried accusations but gentle encouragement. Jake's voice offering guidance when difficult decisions arose or loneliness threatened to overwhelm him. The friendship that had seemed lost forever had been restored in a form that transcended death, built not on shared adventures but on forgiveness freely given and redemption honestly earned. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Boone would sit beneath the great tree and remember the young men they'd been when the world seemed full of promise and their friendship felt as eternal as the mountains themselves. Those memories no longer carried the sting of regret, but the warmth of love redeemed and honor restored. The line shack served its purpose again, not as a supernatural prison where guilt demanded payment, but as a sanctuary where weary souls could find rest and healing. Travelers spoke of the old man who lived beside the ancient oak, whose gentle manner and generous spirit reminded them that goodness still existed in a world that often seemed cruel and uncaring. As the sun climbed higher into the endless Montana sky, Boone touched the bark of the young tree he'd planted in honor of friendship reborn. Its leaves rustled in response to his gentle touch, and in that whisper of wind through tender branches, he heard the echo of laughter shared beside mountain campfires when they were young and believed they could change the world. They had changed the world, he realized, not through silver and wealth, but through love and sacrifice and the patient work of redemption. The tree would grow tall and strong, its roots drinking deep from soil enriched by forgiveness, its branches offering shade to future generations who would never know the price that had been paid for the peace they inherited. Some mistakes follow you home, but love follows you further.